All right, welcome back. We are MDEV1004. That's Mobile ABIs and Frameworks in the summer 2023 semester, although it doesn't feel like summer today. It feels like a rainy, soppy day. And we're supposed to get, like, at least in my area, 30 millimeters to 50 millimeters today of rain. Right? It's supposed to be a lot of rain today. It's week 6, part 1 of our broadcast and recording, and I just wanted to go over a few things before we get started with our demo. This week we're sitting at June 12th. Today's about authentication, and in-class exercise 5 is due this weekend. And I wanted to talk about a couple things here in terms of our structure. Assignment 2, I released it, but I told you that the details are forthcoming, and I want to talk about Assignment 2 details now. Let's get into that. So I posted Assignment 2 details. It's exactly what you would have expected. I've pushed it out till next week, not this week, but next week, which is in the same time. And some people are like, why are you giving us 2 things to do at once? I'm not. I'm asking you to do it as soon as possible, right? I would get this assignment done this weekend if I was you, right? So that way it alleviates your stress, right? Because otherwise, if you wait till next weekend, it's going to be double. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm giving you basically two full weekends, 2 full weeks to get this done. You're going to have 1 full week to get your midterm test done, and so I'm giving you leeway. And I always think about leeway in a positive and negative thing. Positive, you get leeway, you can do whatever you want. Negative, usually you have enough rope to hang yourself, right? And so that's kind of why I'm like. And I mean that in a very facetious way. I don't mean it in any realistic way. I mean, you have so much room that you decide to procrastinate until the end of the week, and then you have 2 things that are due at the same time. Please don't do this. I'm giving you a test. I'm going to give it to you on Monday, usually around this time, and I'm going to give it to you until Friday when this is going to be due. So you're not going to have until Sunday for the test. It's going to be Monday to Friday. I'll give you until Sunday to do the assignment 2, but Friday is when your midterm test is going to be due. So you have a whole week to do it instead of 1 session. On next week, as for next week, I'm going to post this again before we go into this more in detail. I'm not going to be here physically next week. It doesn't make any sense. So next week we'll do a kind of a remote class. I will appear on Monday morning just to talk about the test, but it's a take-home test, right? So basically you do your thing. It's not going to be geared for more than 3 hours. I'm not going to make it so that it's going to be you have the whole week, so I'm going to make it an insane assignment. No, 3 hours maximum. You should be able to finish this thing off. I don't even think 3 hours. If you've done your homework, next week's midterm test is going to be exactly what you just said earlier, which is it looks the same as something that we've already done. Maybe the data block will be different. The model might be slightly different, and some other things that might mess you up if you don't know what you're doing, because you're going to have to come up with those things. But in terms of the structure, the routing, the stuff that we've already done, it's not going to be any different than what you already have. I've been training you guys to be able to put together an API of any type. It just means that the data and the model and the roots might be slightly different. That's it, right? So that's what to expect next week. So there's no need to come in. I'll be also remote next week, just letting you know, and I'll post a message just in case for some reason more than 1 or 2 people come in or decide to come in that day. Okay, but I will be available throughout the week to answer questions. If you're stuck with something, something doesn't work, then that session we're going to get together next week. I'll also answer things like if you have a problem with some of your marks or something like that, because it is mid-semester break. After that, you won't see me not next week, but then, until the week after. We won't be seeing each other until, after July 1st, right? Because it's going to be the week of leading up to July 1st, long weekend, and then after that, right? So I think it's July 2nd. July 3rd is the first time we get together again. So just letting you know, that's what it's going to be. But on that then, if we go back to our assignment just for a second. So the assignment is full CRUD with authentication, but the authentication piece is not required. And let me explain what it means. I want it functional, but I don't need every endpoint to be blocked if you're not logged in. And I'll tell you why. Because when I do authentication, we usually take 2 weeks. The first week we do authentication, we do basic session stuff, right? And the second week we do JWT, right? So if you're accessing something and you need to log in, for to have a, kind of a secure backend, you need to have some kind of token that you're going to pass to the back end. That's another layer. And for me to do it in 1 week is too much. I've done it before. I think it blows people's brains out. And I don't want to do that because there's just so much rework that we have to do. And you really need to, you probably won't need it for the most part, JWT. Well, you may not need it if you're accessing, kind of an API. Most likely you'll be using an API key. And the API key will identify you, who you are, right? And allow you to log in a lot of times and create almost like, kind of it won't be a session, but every time you kind of access the API, it'll identify who you are. That's what the API key does, right? Usually API keys are preferred over username and password anyway, because, and you have to register for it, you kind of register. Once you register, it gives you an API key that's random, and that API key is something that you use over and over again. Then we know who is the person that's using it, or who is responsible for that kind of stuff, for an API, typically. Sometimes APIs are also, on the back end, they're completely protected, and you need to log in, and that's tokens, where you generate a new token every single time you log in, right? That's a different solution, and that's like I said, those are things we're going to talk about probably the week after, which is the week we get back from break. So on this one, all you need to do is full CRUD. We've already talked about CRUD, create, read, update, delete. I know it's an ugly word, CRUD, but here are the things you need. Basically what we've done already in our in-class exercise. I want you guys to do 5 API endpoints, officially, and all that kind of stuff with your movies, clearly not mine, right? So that's something that you need to do. You're going to build on your assignment 1. So it's like everything that you did from assignment 1. Think about this assignment, the assignments I give you, as 2 parts of a larger assignment. That's all this is. I've just broken it up into 2 parts. I'm still giving you 10 marks for your previous stuff. So if you don't, for some reason, have the stuff I want, you lose 10 marks. That's what happens. But, for the most part, it's like you're building on the first assignment. And I do that a lot of times because I want to make it so it's chunkable. I kind of think about that word. It's kind of like my own word. But the reason why I'm thinking about that is because I know there's a lot to do. There's a lot of little things. And this is also a group assignment. So if you and someone else want to get together and pair program to make it easier and so on, it shouldn't be a load to make this thing happen. I've given you some details in terms of what I'm looking for and where the marks are going to come from, okay? And also I talk about things like authentication. Authentication does play a role in terms of marks for your assignments. So today's in-class exercise will help you prepare for this assignment 2. Okay, that's what it's supposed to do. And then now you're going to ask, of course, like I said, what are we doing for your exam, your midterm test? And like I said, there probably won't be authentication. Okay, I'm just giving it to you now. You're getting tested on it on your assignment. I don't think I'm going to put it in your exam too. I don't think so. Okay, I'm probably not going to ask for that. I'm probably going to ask you, like I said, to put together an API for a different data set. That's probably what I'm going to get you to do, right? So it doesn't mean that you couldn't start with something you already have and modify the code, which means it could be within an hour you can finish this whole thing off, right? That's what I'm thinking about for your exam. It's not going to be difficult. I think if you know what you're doing, now it has to be live. These are the things that are going to happen. Just like this is supposed to be live, your exam will have to be live, which means you'll have to probably have a separate live site just because it won't be, I don't want it to clash with your assignment, those kind of things. I think that's important for you to do. For your assignment, you can use the same live site. Assignment 1, assignment 2. I mean, I think you need a live site for assignment 1 already, and so assignment 2 will be just building off of assignment 1, so you can use the same live site. It's okay. If you wanted to use a different one, that's okay too. If that is going to be, maybe it's something easier, or you want to compartmentalize, you don't have to have the same one. Some people have also come up with, I got to talk about this. They've also come up with an assignments GitHub repository. I would have liked to have each assignment separate, but if you made an assignments GitHub repository, I'm okay. If you're going to do that with you and your partner. Problem with making an assignments repository is if your partners change from one group to the other. Remember, for this assignment, you need to join a separate group. And I'm just going to point this out again, that we did this already, but I'm going to tell you that if you look at groups, right, then for assignment 2, there is assignment 2 groups, right? A groups 1, A groups 2. I can see clearly that no one has joined these things right now. So I would ask, if you're going to think about putting together assignment 2, join a group as soon as possible. Again, even if you're a group of 1, you need to join a group or else you will not be able to submit your assignment 2. Okay, that's what's going on with assignment 2. And Robert, are you good with questions? I don't have anybody online. Yeah, I don't think there's going to be much. I really don't think there's anything that's out of the ordinary or not straightforward about what I'm asking, okay? I've just given you an extended period of time because I know times are short, the time frame, okay? However, realistically, if it was me and what I would do, I would probably knock off assignment 2 this weekend, along with in-class exercise 5, because they're related. In-class exercise 5 is assignment 2, right? It's just that with a different data set, your data set compared to mine, right? And a different, probably a different back end. You know, you have a back end for your in-class exercise 5. You're probably gonna have another back end for your assignment 2. And so I probably would do this at the same time because it makes sense, okay? It's kind of like you're getting paid twice for it, but it's like lots of homework. What you're getting actually, and this is my underlying motive, I think is the right way to say it, is I want you to play with this stuff as much as possible. You've seen it and you're seeing it and you see it again and it's the same thing, and it should just be something that you're very familiar with at the end. That's what I'm trying to get to, right? So if you see it a couple times, I'm not hurt by it. I don't care if I pay you twice and 3 times for the same thing, as long as you get it. If you get it, I'm happy. It satisfies my requirements and it satisfies your requirements too, for what you need to do. All right, so that's the stuff. Last week we talked about Node.js and full CRUD. We've kind of did a full example about that. And in-class exercise 4 was due just this Sunday. I marked everything up to in-class exercise 3. That's where I get all the feedback. I sent a little feedback email. Assignment 1 was also due this Sunday. And so, again, no marking for that yet, but just because you just submitted it. This week, we're going to talk Intro to Authentication and Authorization. We're going to build off of your project from last week, right, which is what I've just already done. I've copy-pasted. And we're going to talk about Passport. You guys did Passport before?
No.
You ever did authentication with thing? Oh, this is all new to you then. Good. Now, warning and disclaimer. Let's talk about this. The code that I was using before may not work today. So I have some code examples that I've embedded in the PowerPoint, but we may have to do a little bit of magic to make it work, right? So this is wrong. This should be week 8. This should be the 18th, which is this weekend. That's what's happening there. Okay, so let's talk about Passport a little bit. So Passport it's part of something we always want to use. And authentication, there's 2 types of things we have to worry about when it comes to security generally. Like I'm talking about general security. There's 2 parts to it. There's authentication and authorization. So what's the difference between authentication and authorization? Robert, what do you think that is?
Authentication means you're logging in and passing credentials back and forth.
Uh-huh.
The second one,
authorization
means that you already have the credentials and you're just reapplying them in order to do something.
It's like authentication to me is who are you? Who are you? It's identity more than anything. So when I think about authentication, I'm authenticating myself. It's me. That's authentication. And that's why we have 2-step authentication these days and those kind of things. And also there's OAuth, third-party authentication we're going to talk about with Facebook. I don't know if you use that, or GitHub, or something else, LinkedIn, or whatever, Google. People use Google and Microsoft to authenticate, right? Because they already have an account. We'll talk about that in a second. Authorization is what you're authorized to do. So authentication is who am I? Authorization is what can I do in the system? What am I allowed to do? And there's different levels of authorization, administrator versus a regular user, and so on, right? That's the difference. And we're not really going to talk about authorization too much, because that's a whole other level. This is not a security course. If this was, then we would talk about more deep authorization, how to make roles, and all the user roles and all that kind of stuff. And that requires another layer of, challenge when it comes to your backend database and all that stuff. Even another model, like a user model that includes, your role. What is your role? And only users with a certain role can access certain features, of your site. For example, things like user registration might be something that only an admin can do, right? Or maybe user management, like I'm talking about for managing all users is only an admin. The other reason why we use authorization a lot of times is if I have a shared server and I want to authorize myself to be able to do something with my data set. It's using the same data, but I can filter what I see compared to somebody else with some kind of authorization, right? That's the other thing that I might use, but you can also do that with username. You can also do that with a lot of ways of doing things. But usually authorization is what you can do in the system. Do I have a different dashboard? Do I have different capabilities? Do I have access to the back end? Can I do other things on the site that I'm going to do? In this case, from an API perspective, it doesn't make sense. Either you have access or you don't have access. That's all it is. So most APIs are open, like they're not closed up. If it's an API that you can use, example Discord, all you need to do is set up an API key and you're good to go. All right. But if it's locked up, if it's an API that's locked up, usually it's usually some kind of an API key or password with token, which we'll talk about. So Express doesn't have this stuff. Express, we talked about before, is just a layer on top of Node, right? It doesn't have a feature for authentication. It'd be nice if it did, but it doesn't, okay? Just like it doesn't have access to Mongo, right? So we need something else. And Passport is a module that we can use to do this, right? And let's get into the best way to look at Passport, in my opinion, is to look at Passport.js, which is the site. And I've shared this link with you guys on Blackboard, but basically what it is it's managed and owned by Auth0, which is interesting. Auth0 actually kind of manages this thing. So Passport is just a node module. And there's different kinds of strategies. So one thing that we're going to be talking about is different strategies. And if you look here, you can say search for strategies. So here's some stuff that you can do. I want to use Passport with Google for something called OAuth. Okay, again, this is not a security course, but let's talk about OAuth for 1 second. It's a strategy. It's a third-party authentication strategy. So what that means is it's about trust. Okay. So imagine, let's talk about trust for a second. Just really 2 seconds, right? Trust. You have a friend, they're very close to you. You trust them, right? You trust them with your secrets. You trust them with your feelings. You trust them with your wife, whatever. You trust them going into your house that they're not going to steal stuff, right? They're your friend. They're a buddy, right? Or someone that you like to hang out with, right? So because you trust them, right? And if you trust me, right? So you trust me and you trust them, and you say, hey, listen, I want you to, because you have a buddy, let's what's your buddy's name? Give me one of your best friends. Doesn't matter. Jerry. Let's suppose your best friend Jerry, right? Because you trust me and you trust them, you say, hey, Jerry, I want you to meet Tom. I trust Tom, he's my professor, and I trust Jerry, he's my best friend, and because you trust Jerry and I trust you, then I trust Jerry. It's a third-party trust relationship, right? That's what it is. So it's kind of the same thing when it comes to Google and Microsoft and that kind of stuff. So here's how it works. If Microsoft trusts me, Microsoft is a much bigger organization than we would be if we were going to make our own authentication system, way more secure than anything that we can probably put up, create. If Microsoft trusts me, then most likely you're going to trust me, right? Or if Google trusts me, the same thing, right? That's the idea with OAuth. The great thing about OAuth is that it allows you to use your credentials from another third party, larger AAA kind of, third party, service. So I don't have to duplicate my credentials every single time for 20 sites, 50 sites, 100 sites. However, a lot of times what happens is you authorize, you kind of create an authorization between the third-party agency, things like, for example, Microsoft or Google, to authorize this website to have access to my credentials. That's another thing. It's a kind of a two-way trust, right? I'm saying, yeah, this site can use my credentials, Microsoft. Give them my username and password. Kind of weird, right? But it's okay because we also have something else happening nowadays, which is multi-factor authentication. Now, again, this is not a security course, and if we were going to do security, I'd probably work with something called multi-factor authentication, usually two-step. So you have some kind of, everyone has this, but I'm just saying it for people who don't. You should. If you don't have multi-factor authentication right now for your main sites, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, if you use that thing, Twitter, you should always have multi-factor authentication for everything that you do. Because passwords are just not strong enough, no matter what you do. Passwords can be defeated, but multi-factor authentication gives you another layer of protection, which means they need your authenticator app, usually, as something else that, that you can use. So the way multi-factor works is you log in with something that you know, your password, right, which identifies you. You log in with something that you have, which is your authenticator, right? Usually it's a virtual authenticator or whether it's something else, right? And then you could have a third thing, which is you log in a place you should be logging in from. That's another layer we don't do for the most part. Example, you only authorize yourself to log in from home, right? Which is a specific, so think about that layer of protection. We don't have that most of the time. Or you can only log in from an IP address that's known, school, as an example, right? That would be another layer. And then there'd be a fourth thing, right? Which is you have to log in with something that to identify who you are, like physically who you are, like retina scan, biometrics, all those kind of things, right? That's another layer. So there's many layers of multi-factor authentication. And there's another one too, which is you can only log in at a specific time. Oh yeah, right? So all these things we're talking about, you would think about more security, but we also, when we think about security, there's kind of a balance we want to play. Most companies do this, between security and convenience, right? It can be very secure to log in somewhere, but very inconvenient. Like you'll really be angry every single time you log in. Like, what do you want? Some blood, right? You want blood from me to log in, That's pretty inconvenient, but most likely super secure, right? Because, getting a blood vial, is pretty tough. Or especially if you need a blood vial with a specific IP at a certain time and your authenticator plus your password and maybe some other second piece of biometrics like eye scan or something like that, or your heartbeat, which is also has been identified as unique, right? So your actual your rhythm, your heart rhythm is what it's called, right? So all these things can make it a very secure site, but you know what the crazy thing is, as we get towards quantum computing, which is interesting, quantum computing is said to defeat all of that, right? Because it can spoof everything and it can be kind of true and not true at the same time using something called qubits. So that's going to be another level of thing. Blockchain is maybe something that we're going to be using in the future just for authentication, right? Because where your credentials are spread out amongst a bunch of different sites, and you have to be authenticated by multiple sites at the same time. That's kind of interesting, right? Where qubits and quantum computing won't be able to do that as efficiently. There might be some kind of delay. Anyways, we'll talk more about that maybe in another class, another time. But these are very popular, connections. So again, you can see here that I can use Facebook, I can use Google, I can use Twitter, I can use whatever. And if you type in any kind of strategy up here, like let's say, for example, if I say LinkedIn, right, you can see LinkedIn is there. They have authentication strategies for almost every, major site that's out there, okay? Like example, if I say something like Microsoft, you can see Microsoft is there. And so Passport is has worked with all these, kind of third-party agencies, institutions to kind of provide another type of strategy. For us, the one we're going to care about today is the username and password strategy, which is the weakest one, okay? But still largely in use today. Number one way of logging in is username and password, right? With some kind of secondary thing, an OAuth strategy with, again, two-factor, okay, multi-factor authentication. If we go to the documentation here, right, it talks about things like tutorials and how-to guides, and there's also a bunch of other stuff here that they allow you to do, right? There's something called some other concepts like API authentication, right? So it says the following is a list of strategies that implement authentication schemes used when protecting API endpoints. Okay, so here's some different ones that they use. One is JWT, which is one thing that we'll cover as well. There's also a local API key, which is something that is there. There's also a bearer, and there's a bunch of other ones. If we go to local API key, as an example, it talks about how to put this together. So passport-local API key is the authentication strategy that we would be doing, and it is literally just another NPM, kind of package. We won't be doing it today, okay? But we will be trying to do this local API key for it. What it does is it will create a kind of an API key, right? So it'll kind of register you, and then once you've registered with an API key, it has all the examples you need to make sure this is pretty good, and it is a GitHub repository. A lot of these are where you can actually register and everything else. Notice how old this is, okay? This is always concerning to me. Whenever I see something like this old for API authentication, 11 years, 10 years, there's two things. One, it hasn't needed to be updated, number one, or two, it's not used. One of the two. And mostly it's the second one. It's not used, right? Which means that's not a great thing. Okay, so that's kind of something that we got to think about. Is there another way of doing API authentication with this? This is just one example. And again, you can see that it's the developer that has done that, right? And we can look at other API schemes as well. Okay, so that's kind of, we can look at in terms of this. So that's one. Features of this, here it says 500 authentication strategies, sign-in, single sign-on. That's another way of doing things with OpenID and OAuth. That's a very big one. Single sign-on. SSO is what it's called, which is what we use here at Georgian. So we use a single sign-on to access all of our stuff on our website. So it provides that. Persistent sessions, and I'm just looking at other things that might make sense to you. I think those are pretty good, right? So, and then it talks about kind of strategies, and like I said to you, there's tons of them if you want to. If we put an API in there, you can see that there's other ones. Passport edmodo.-API, passport strategy for authenticating using at Edmodo API app launch time, whatever that is, right? So I put an API, there's lots and lots of ways of doing things. And you can look through some of these strategies too, right? So although it's not something that you may want to look at right away, there's tons and tons. There's a big strategy list. Going back to documentation, there's some great how-to guides for username and password. All right, so this is kind of something that we're going to be using. And the first thing we're going to start off with is Passport Local. Now, here's something that we're going to do. I have to mention this as well. Passport is not necessarily, doesn't care about the back end. It doesn't know how what back end you have. It doesn't know that you have Mongo. It doesn't know that you have Firebase. It doesn't know that you have anything, right? All it knows is that you need authentication, right? So there's another thing we're going to be using that I'm going to try and use today called Passport Local Mongoose, right? Which is another NPM module. And what it does is it helps us with connecting to and authenticating. One thing that we're going to be doing is when we talk about authentication is encryption and decryption strategies, right? So one thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to, and encryption and decryption is also called serialization and deserialization, similar to what we're doing with our data, right? When we encrypt and decrypt, serialize and deserialize, right? Same thing. So I want to serialize and deserialize a user, and we're going to be doing that with Passport Local Mongoose. Okay, so another thing we're going to do. So without further ado, let's talk about the code a little bit. Okay, so first let's add in, let's install Passport and also Passport Local Mongoose inside of our application. For this, what I've done is I've made a copy of my previous in-class exercise 4 to in-class exercise 5. That's what I've done. So here I'm just going to pull up Visual Studio Code. Again, I'm using the Windows side, but you can certainly do this on the Mac the exact same way for the most part. By the way, Robert had this issue with NVM. Let's talk about that.
I did it this morning too. So first thing I checked, I run my manager,
And it's bad?
and it jumped back. So every time I launch the thing, I have to set it. But I think that there's a default setting that has it set.
No.
So I just have to change the default setting.
What I did to fix I had the same problem as you. Okay, so that's why when you said it, I was like, oh God, he's experiencing the same thing. So it must be an NVM issue. Let me end with Homebrew. If I was going to teleport now, let's go into, because we got to talk about it a little bit, because I'm sure some of you might be experiencing the same thing as Robert experienced, which is what I've experienced as well. And I'm just going to go into my Mac for a second. Okay, so just transport in there for a second. And I want to talk about this because you might be experiencing this.
Pretty funky.
Yeah, it is. So let's just do this for a second, okay? So I'm just going to get out of this. And let me talk about just pulling up an iTerminal. So if I do something like NVM list with a Mac, it looks different than a Windows system. It looks like this, right? Yeah. And notice that it says it's system. It says system. And if I do a node -- version, right, it says 20.2.0. Now let me explain what I did in order for me to do this. I removed all other versions of node from my system. And so it didn't have a choice. That's how I fixed it, right? So if I do a homebrew, let me talk about this, how I did it. Homebrew list, right? Brew list. If I do a brew list, I'll be okay. Right? What brew list does is it will list all the modules that you've installed, including node modules, right? Like node itself. So if you look back here, you can see that I have node in here. Here's node, okay? And there's NVM. Sometimes what you'll have is prior versions of node will be here as well from brew. For example, node at 16, node at 18, node at 14. Remove those. Make sure you do a brew uninstall node at and whatever the number is. Sometimes that'll be the issue here, all right? And you can do manual removal as well, but for the most part, that is my thing. Notice here, as an example, I have several versions of Python, right? This is how your node would come off too. Python at 3.9, right? Python at 3.8. I could remove previous versions of Python, no problem, by saying something like brew uninstall Python at 3.10, right? And then it would remove that, okay? So that can also be something that can help you, because if you only give your NVM one choice, then it's going to give you that every time. That's why I solved it.
But you have node, and then you have node at whatever.
I did. Okay. But like I said, if I did an NVM list, sometimes what I also had in my NVM list was I had multiple versions of node that was installed. Notice that everything here is NA, right? Yeah. I've installed every other version of node away from here, all right? And it likes to default to 18.9.0 for some reason or another. I'm not sure why it did that. I guess it's the latest version, and NVM kind of says this is kind of like the stable version, right? So then you should give me 18.9 and not the bleeding edge version, which is 20.2 that we're using. But I forced it to use 20.2 because I removed all the other ones. That's what I've done, okay? All right. So like again, stable, node stable is at 20.2.0. That's the default. If I say install node stable, which is what I have. Okay. Okay, so that's how I dealt with it. That's how I dealt with it. Again, you might deal with it in different ways. Back to the code.
But I know what it is now.
Yes, that's the thing. Back to the code. So I want to do this. And here I am in Visual Studio Code. What I want to do is package.json. Let's make sure that it's got the right in-class exercise 5 in here. Make sure you do that for yourself too, right? Here's in-class exercise 5. And one thing we can also do when we make an API is attach a README file, right? And we're going to do that today a little bit. So first, I'm just going to go control backtick. Again, that works on Mac and Windows. And I'm going to say git add dots, git commit -m, and I'll say added project files for ICE5, git push. Okay. So a couple ways to add a readme.md file. You can do it locally here, or you can do it online. If you did it online, what would happen is you're going to be ahead of your local project by at least one commit. Then you'd have to do a pull. Okay, that's what you have to do. But let's do it locally here just to set up an MD file. The way you do is click down here so that this whole thing is highlighted, not in a specific folder. And I'm going to click on this little plus button, and I'm going to call this readme, usually it's in caps like this, .md lowercase. And if you do that and press enter, it gives you a readme file. Now, I also have an extension for Visual Studio Code that allows me to kind of preview what it's going to look like on the right-hand side, all right? So that's the extension I'm using. Now, you don't need it, but that's what I'm using, okay? On the left, it's Markdown. Markdown means if you use one hashtag, it's like an H1. 2 hashtags is like an H2, okay? And there's a lot of other things you can do. If you want to learn about Markdown, it's not quite HTML, but there's very similar things you can do with it, okay? It's great for documentation purposes. So for me, all I care about is let's put one single hashtag and something like MDEV. You can see what it does on the right, 1004 in the summer 2023 semester, and then this is ICE 5 is what we want to put in there, and we can have a second piece there underneath. We can say, demo project for in-class exercise 5 in the summer 2023 semester at Georgian College. So that's kind of your details. You can see how nice it looks on the right-hand side, right? And so that's what you can do. If I use a third hashtag, if I did that, you can see that it just makes it smaller, like an H2 or an H3, okay? So you can slowly do that. If you don't use any hashtags, it just makes it really small like this, okay? So which is like paragraph text, okay? So I'm just showing you how this works. It's pretty straightforward. And now that we've had a README file, we can add it in. We can do another little thing here. So clear git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say added README file. Okay, there we go. So that kind of pushes that up. Okay. Pretty straightforward. One thing that we also have here, whenever I look at Visual Studio Code, I see that I have extensions that need to be updated, right? And it says live share and NX console has to be updated, and it says reload required. I'm going to do that. I always want to keep my extensions updated, so that's one thing I want to do. It doesn't take much to do that, okay? And the other thing that I want to do is make sure that everything is up to date. I don't like my Visual Studio Code being out of date, so I kind of click down here and I will restart to update. I'm okay with that. And I think these are good practices because this way your Visual Studio Code has latest and greatest. It's also going to have bug fixes and a bunch of other stuff that Visual Studio Code will give you if you continuously upgrade. I like to do that. Okay, we've upgraded Visual Studio Code. Let's take a look at the release notes. Looks like there's nothing that's crazy. It says read-only mode, paste as options. That's good. Notebooks, rich content search, linked editing for JSX tags. That's cool. VS Code at Microsoft Build 2023. They had some other things there that they did, different accessibility options, and so on. So some really cool little features. You can always read those later on. For me, what I want to do now is let's close some of this down. Now that we have this, I want to add in Passport Local and Passport Local Mongoose, as well as Passport itself. So there's three things we're actually adding in: Passport, Passport Local Mongoose. Those are the three things. Okay, let's do this. So here, I'm just going to kind of go in here and type in yarn add passport, passport local mongoose. Okay, I'm going to do those things. And then when I do that, you're going to see that it's going to add those three project dependencies to our project. That's what it's going to do. Okay, now let's check what node module says about all of them. Okay, before we add the at types, because things have changed, like I said before. So passport, does it have a d.ts file? The answer is no. So passport needs one. Passport local, does it have a d.ts file? I mean, you know, it does not. So you need some support there too. Passport local mongoose, does it have a d.ts file? It does. Okay, please be aware of these things. So passport local mongoose, right, already has a d.ts file. What is a d.ts file? What it does is it adds in a, type definition library for each of the, your documents. Okay, that's one thing it does. So passport local, if you look here, does not have it. All right, does not have passport local. It does not have a TypeScript, and neither does passport, right? Because usually it has. You'll see the d.ts file at the end. Okay, so it doesn't have that in here. So we need passport and passport local, but not passport local mongoose typically. Let's try this out. So again, it'd be the same. Second one now. Let me just take a look. I'm just going to go away from our node modules just for a second. Notice like node modules glowed red for a second for a reason. And here is the dev dependencies. Again, if I was going to ask you the question on an interview and I said, what's the difference between a dev dependency and a dependency? Your answer should be something like a dependency is for the project and a dev dependency is for me as a developer. All right? I don't need them, but I'm using them. Okay, let's try this out. So again, it's yarn add at types and then / passport. Okay? We'll add one at a time because it'll tell us if there's any issues, okay? And then yarn add at types passport - local. And of course I did this wrong. Let's fix this problem. So sorry, let's remove those again. So again, I meant to put it inside of my dev dependencies. Now it's only going up here. I don't want them here. I want them down here. So that's how I want them to be organized. Let's try this again. Okay. By the way, here's something. Does it matter in node modules where they're stored? Like, does this organize this differently? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Right. So yes, that's what I was going to suggest. You can just cut and paste them down into where you need them to. So you can probably just do something like this. You can say, I don't need them here, right? So I want to put them here, MNOP, try and keep it in kind of order as what I recommend, but you don't need them up here, okay? So this way everything is in order, okay? And so far so good, but we got a bit of an issue. And the issue seems to stem from our passport local mongoose. And we're going to get this issue here where if you scroll down, it says that the model, it says there's a problem. It cannot find the name model. Okay? It's just putting this out there to you. So again, it says extends model. That's what it does. And so there's always been some issues with this, with queries and all this stuff. But just keep in mind, this is just our node modules, and it's just for code hinting. So really, largely we can ignore most of it. Okay?
Mine doesn't have that error.
Yay.
So I'm okay.
Like I said, largely we can ignore it. Yeah.
So it's a versioning thing on your machine?
Nope. Nope. It's just the way it works. I looked in there because I opened it up and looked in there. I suddenly had a problem. Okay? So that's how it works. There's also some 3 extensions now that also need a reload. Okay, let's reload. Okay. So let's get back to this. All right, so now that we have this, again, always we want to be able to test our project to see if we didn't break something. So again, I'm just going to do Control backtick, and I'm going to type in Control Shift B or Command Shift B on a Mac, right? So Control Shift B, it'll bring up your task runner where you can do the watch task. And what this will do is it will recompile everything or transpile everything so that we have the latest version transpiled. Notice it says 0 errors. This is a good sign, okay? And then what I want to do is add another little thing that allows me to do nodemon. So nodemon, again, will connect to your MongoDB Atlas that we have. We're not changing the data right now for MongoDB Atlas. It's up there, right? And we should see it connected to MongoDB. Awesome. This is great. And the next thing, of course, is trying to test it locally, which is something like, hey, I want to do, localhost 3000, and it says cannot get. This is good because we're supposed to put localhost 3000 / API / list, and you can see now we still have access to all this. This is all of our, these are all of our movies, and that's what you should have right now. Okay. What we want to do is we want to kind of create authentication strategies for this too, and that is the next step that we're going to go to. Okay, let's get back over here. So we just tested it out. It says there's no favicon. That's okay. And I'm going to go to my server, which is inside of my server. I'm going to go to my config, and I'm going to go to my app.ts here. And now that we've started to use everything, we have our database modules, and these are very good. These are all our connections to the database. And what I want is also for us to have our authentication modules. I'm just going to put them up above here. So I've given you some code that we can use for all this stuff. So configuring looks like this. We want to configure session, right? Notice that there's a module called express session, right, that we don't have. And also passport local, all right? Passport and passport local. So one thing we also want to add in is express session, which we don't have. We haven't done yet. Let's do that. So session-based authentication is what we're going to be doing, okay? So back to that. Let's go to it. So I'm going to go back to this, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say, kind of back to where we were doing all of our installs. We're going to say yarn add express dash session, which is another thing we want to add in. Here's the express session. And we also want to add in, again, nowadays we should check to see if express session has its own type definition library. So if I go into express session, do I have a d.ts file in here? And the answer is we do not, which means to get good code hinting, we want to add it in. So we'll say yarn add at types express dash session -- dev, which is what I forgot to put last time, which should add in your session, right? The code hinting for express session. Code hinting means TypeScript support. Okay. So if I go down and if I look at package.json, we've also added in express session, right? Because we're going to use session-based authentication for this, right? As well as the @types express session dev dependency for type definition library. So please add that in, Robert. That's all we did. Okay. Next, in our app.ts, up at the top, I want to be able to put that stuff in. And in the PowerPoint, it actually gives you some code that we can use so it can help us speed along. So I'm going to do that first just to set it up. I'm going to grab these first few lines of code here, right, which is our modules for authentication. And I'm just going to put that in. So that's the first thing. Now, it says passport local. And it says passport local has a bit of an issue. It says cannot find module passport local or its corresponding data types. How is that possible, you might ask, if I've got passport local installed? How is that possible? And it's not possible. It's just that I had a weird copy-paste error. So passport local is there. Okay? So those are the three new modules: import session, import passport local, right? And those are the modules we need for authentication. These modules up here are just to set up our, so I'm going to put that up here. So these modules for Express, that's what they are. That's setting up the Express server, right? These are the ones we need for the Express server. These are the modules for authentication. This is the database modules that we're going to use for Mongoose and so on, okay? Next, if we go back to our project, it says we need some authentication objects. And one thing we talk about is a local strategy that we're going to use in a second. But there's also something else we need, which is a models.user. We don't have a user model, and so I've provided it for you. Let's use this user model right here to save us some time, okay? Let's get into that. So I'm going to go back into our models, and I want to make a new model, new file called user.ts. This is going to be our user model. And I'm going to start typing some of this stuff. So like it says here, I want to use passport mongoose from passport local schema from mongoose, as well as schema and passport local mongoose. I want to use, this is the first part. And I want to talk about why I'm copy pasting as opposed to everything else, because this way you can see if there's any errors. So the first part is mongoose. I'm going to import mongoose, and I'm also going to import something called passport local schema from mongoose. All right, so mongoose knows about passport, right? They kind of interplay together. That's the first part. So that's the first part of my module. Again, I've shared this with you up on Blackboard, and you can certainly copy paste from this. Next part is the user schema. All right, here's my user schema. Just going to copy this and go here and put it in. And let's talk about it a little bit. So the user schema is a new schema. And what I'm using is a username that is a string type, an email address that is a string type, a display name that is a string type, when it was created, and when it was updated. Now you can see that these options here are examples of extended type definition for Mongo, all right? So I'm creating a Mongo or Mongoose schema, and type date and default date.now is just an extended way of giving us default data, as well as the type that you can mention here. Instead of doing it like this, where we mention strings and numbers and whatever, like we did with the movie model, the movie model looks like this, right? The movie model, we also use something like an iMovie, which is interesting that we made an interface called iMovie, right? And we can certainly try and do that as well if we run into problems. And I'm going to talk about why we want to do this. The iMovie interface is interesting because what it does is it uses a structure for us for TypeScript to help us out. So this is one way of doing it. I'm going to do it another way with my user.ts for the first part and see if it makes any sense to you. Here's the way we're going to do this. In the second part of the PowerPoint, I have this. I have a user schema plugin, and I'm going to plug in passport local mongoose. So a plugin is middleware. It's almost like I'm injecting passport local mongoose to help me with serialization and deserialization, okay? So I'm going to grab these last lines here and see what happens, okay? I'm going to come in here and paste them in. And let me talk about them so you understand what happens. So here's passport local schema, and it says generic type passport local schema, doc type model, and blah, blah, blah. It says requires between 2 and 4 type arguments. Okay, so that's the error that you're going to get immediately. You should get that error too, yes? I'll wait for Robert to catch up since he's the only one that's here.
No, I'm a little bit behind.
Okay. But notice what it says here. It says, so this is what it needs. And I've also declared a global. This is interesting. This is another way of doing it, where I can declare like an interface, I'm declaring a global, which I call user document. The user document has the exact same structure as my username and my user schema. But what the user document does is it allows me to use the user document outside of this file. When I say declare a global for TypeScript, it literally does declare a global type or a global variable or whatever, okay? So here I'm declaring a global type. Now, let's see, the one thing that happens is a lot of times now we get some fixes, kind of things. It says no quick fixes available. If you say view problem, it tells me that it kind of teleports me into this problem here, right? So this is where it says passport local schema requires a doc type, a model, a T instance methods and T helper, query helpers. That's what it requires. It says requires between 2 and 4 argument types, all right? And that's what it gives me, right? So that's what it says passport local schema. I've given it 1 argument type, user schema, okay? So that's one thing that we're going to talk about later on. For now, leave it. Okay, we're going to come back and fix this problem. But it's going to complain, give you an error in a second. But we still already have a user model. A user model is exported. It's called model, right? And the model itself is of type user, right? And so on. Alternatively, what we could have done for this one, instead of passport local schema, we're going to come back to this. We want to cast this user schema as a passport local schema. That's what we want to do. Because our user schema, if you think about what this is, right, it gives us all of this stuff, right? That's what it gives us. So schema as this other thing. We're casting it. And what it does with our model is it makes so that the model, now notice it says the model is of type any, right? The model is of type any. That's not what we want. We want it to be of type passport local schema. Passport local schema came from here, which is inside of the Mongoose documentation, okay? So again, let's go back to our models. And let's go look inside where the error is, passport local schema. And by the way, if you go to type definition, then it takes you right in there. It tells you that passport local mongoose is where that thing is defined. Take a look at that. So let me go back. I'm going to show you that, how I did that. So again, I went to models. And then if you look at passport local schema and highlight it, this is the problem. I can right click and go to type definition. And what this does, TypeScript, it allows us to go in and do some troubleshooting. And it says, okay, so why does it need between 2 and 4 different things, different variables, right? Because that's what it's telling us. It says we need this many, right? And it says schema, it doesn't know what schema is. It doesn't know what schema is. So that's funny because schema is something that should come from passport, right? That's what it should come from, passport itself and passport local, okay? But we know, if we go back to our type definitions, let's go into package.json for a second. Here's our package.json. We know that we have passport local, but we don't have passport local mongoose in here. If I was to load that in, let me show you what that looks like. So if I do something like yarn add at types passport local mongoose, just to show you, minus dev, what it's going to say is passport local mongoose is not found. They've removed that. They used to be passport local mongoose, but passport local mongoose doesn't exist, right? I'm talking about the type definition because it's included in the passport local mongoose module. That's where it's included itself. Okay. I'm just mentioning it so that you know why we're having this weird funky error. We're getting this error because it says we need 2 and 4 arguments and we're only giving it 1, right? Because we're giving it the model and that's it. The doc type that we're getting itself, there is no document type that we're passing into the type. So remember up here where we said that the schema itself could have a type. If I go back to the movie schema that we had a type, an interface, right? And we had the type that went in here and a type that went down here for the model. Let's try doing that same thing with our project. So we're going to say we want to make a type that we're going to call iUser, right, is what we're going to take. Okay, let's try this out. So again, before the schema, we can make an interface. We'll call the interface iUser, where I stands for interface. And usually the iUser interface is going to have the exact same structure as the username and so on, right? I have kind of a structure that goes here, right? So if I copy this part, and if I go back up here, I can certainly put that in there. iUser. This is what it would look like, okay? And you can see that this would be lowercase string, not uppercase string. Okay, just adjusting it just for an interface as opposed to using something else. So these are the iUser interface. And again, we're comparing to the iMovie interface, which is the exact same kind of idea. Okay, iUser, iMovie, same thing. Okay, we don't need the ID because the ID is always something that we have in here. And like we did with the movie interface, we did iMovie here, new schema with, we're casting it. We're going to do the same thing, new schema, and we're casting it of type iUser. Okay, so that's something we can put in there. Okay, and it's going to basically say we're pretty good. Now, iUser also has, we're missing created and updated, which is created is a date type, right? And updated, let's make sure that it's correct, because otherwise it's not going to be good. Updated is also a date type. So those are things that are missing from the iUser interface, a date type. And when we do that, it computes. This computes nicely, right? It looks like it's okay. So user schema. Okay, let's see if this helps us in any way. The next part is, right, if I go to movie as a template, once we make the schema, that's one part, all right, so that's what it looks like this. And the next part is we also want to cast the model down here as well. So back into the user, we're going to say model, and we're going to cast it as iUser, right? That's the model that we're going to use to cast, right, with this thing, right? Now that still doesn't take care of our passport local schema problem. Okay, that's what doesn't take care of that at all, right? Again, model now, but suddenly, take a look at this. Even though it doesn't take care of this, passport local schema, take a look at this. It says model is a passport local model. That's good. Which means, do I really need this? Let me just get rid of this for a second. Do I really need this anymore, right? And if I go to model, does it give me passport local model? And it does. Gets rid of my error. I needed to say passport local model because if it doesn't, it won't be able to serialize and deserialize users the exact same way. So that's why I did that set that up in that way before. Which means we don't need to do this anymore. This is what we used to do, like I told you, and now it's not required for Mongoose anymore. So we can kind of simplify our kind of a structure. Nice, nice, nice. And that, my friends, is the user model. Now, why, you're going to ask, do I need this? Sometimes we want to identify something as a user document, okay? And for now, we're not going to need to do this, but later on, we might come back and say, hey, we want to identify something as a user document that includes an ID, okay? That includes an ID, as opposed to a iUser interface, different things. Okay. Save. And do we still have running? Does it have a problem? And if I go back to here, you can see we're still running okay. If I go back to here, we can refresh, we can still get our API list. These are good things. If we can still run and we still get our API list and we're still running okay with our model, That's the next step. Let's put this up on GitHub. So again, I'm going to go here and clear and go git add dot, git commit -m. We'll say added user model, because we need a user model in order for us to have users. Can't do users without a user model. Wonderful. That's fantastic. We have a user model. We need to continue with their configuration. Let's do the configuration first. And then we'll take a short break and we'll actually do user registration and log in and log out. Okay? So let's continue with the configuration. Config. So now that we have our user model, right? I'm going to go back to my config and I'm going to go back to my app.ts and we can continue on with what we were doing. So back to my PowerPoint presentation and back up to this part right here where we have our user model. So one thing is we want to talk about authentication objects. And usually what I want to do is I want to kind of copy this part and this part here, this authentication objects part, I want to take and put in kind of right after I put in my modules for authentication, this part. And it said I want to go into my models, right, /user. Okay, and now why? Because of this little silly mark, right? If you copy paste, it's just that kind of stops it. If I hover over user, now this is the most important part. If I hover over user, it should say user is of type mongoose.passportLocalModel, not a regular model. Here's an example. If I was to go into routes right now, right, or sorry, controllers, and if I looked at the movie controller, okay, here's my movie controller. And in my movie controller, if I was going to look at, as an example, in my movie controller, if I looked at the movie, here's the movie, right? And if I hover over movie, it doesn't say passport local, right? It shouldn't say passport local model, should it? Well, it kind of does, right? And the reason why it does is it says now that we've added in passport, this is how smart it is. It says, well, you know, your iMovie is now, because we're using passport, it's also of type passport local model. Huh, which is really not right. It should be just a model, right? Just putting it out there so you can see what that is. Okay, awesome. So now let's go back to our config and let's get back into this app.ts. So let's save this app.ts file. Again, one step at a time. We should always check to see if we broke something. And you can see here, again, even though we reset, nothing is broken when we added this passport local strategy because we haven't done anything here. Take a look. We haven't actually done any kind of connection. We haven't used anything here inside of our cookie parser and all that stuff. What I'm going to do now is underneath this stuff, this area here where we have, and by the way, whenever we do app use, these are all middleware modules. Okay, middleware modules means we're plugging in. They're like plugins, right? We're plugging in different functionality, Logger, Express, JSON, and so on. Okay, back to this. So I want to do my session. I want to talk about what this is. I want to kind of set this up. But it seems that we need some kind of secret, right? Secret usually is some kind of hash that we use to hash up our sessions, okay? So what we can do is we can set up a secret in our DB config. Back to DB config. Here's our DB config. We can see that we have a default, which is local and remote, and we can set up something called secret. And you can make this whatever you want. I'm just going to call it some secret. Usually this is some kind of hashtag or something that makes sense for you, okay? And then we can share it. We can say that secret is some secret. That's what we want. Or we can just say it's just secret. Secret means this is secret. Let me just put a comma in here. And then this secret here is something that we're sharing with our default. Default means we're making a default object. The object contains three little properties: local URI, remote URI, and secret. Secret, this second secret means this one, right? Just like this remote URI means this one, and this local URI means this one. Okay, that's what those point out to be. Save. Nice, nice, nice. Everything is great. And get back to app.ts. App.ts now has a secret, and I can install it right here. Let's do it. So back to this, I'm going to grab this little piece of code right here, and let's set up our session, express session. So first we set it up. Here's us setting it up. It's not db config, but rather in our case it's db. db.secret, lowercase s, is what we want to use. Okay. And so this sets up our secret, or our session. That's what this does. So session is now set up and it's being used as middleware. Next, once we set up our session, the next part is we want to initialize passport. All right, so that's the next part. Just doing this in order. So initializing passport, we say something like, I want app.use passport.initialize. Again, this is part of our middleware modules, right? And app.use passport session. I can't use a session until I have an express session in use, and that's what this does, okay? This is just configuration, so one-time cost. Okay, next, let's do the next part. I want to implement the strategy, the user strategy, and I also want to use all this part. This is the last part. Let's see if we get any errors here. And again, this should all happen well before the router, okay? And this is what I thought would happen. Okay. So a couple things. Way back up here. So it says local strategy is what we want to use, right? So that's what the strategy is going to be, a passport local strategy. We'll call this strategy. So we know which one we're going to use. Strategies are local strategy. And it says passport use strategy, right? It says strategy is not assignable part of type strategy. Type of strategy is not assignable. Property authenticated is missing the type of strategy, but required to in type strategy. So it's type. So we're going to come back and see what it says in our documentation. Here's something else. I want a passport serialized user, and I want a user.serialized user, and it says that serialized user, no matching overload. Overload 1 of 4, user, user, done, and so on. Again, if I look at serialized user and I go to type definition for serialized user, it's there. And it says that it's going to take a user of type T, right? And a callback, it also takes a callback of any. That's what serialized user does, right? And so we can pass in a couple things. The user object, that's the first part, right? As well as a callback that's optional, an optional callback, and then it returns void. So this user of type T, this T that's up here, we don't know what type it is. A quick fix to take away the error is just put type any. And if you put type any, this is actually in the type definition library for passport local mongoose, which I always struggle with. Save. And if I go back to app.ts, it takes away that error. Yay! Now this error. Let's take a look at that passport use strategy. I'm going to go back to our documentation online for this one. So it says how to use it, right? So here's my configuration that they gave us. Our local strategy is passport local. That's what it does, right? And then when we configure, this is how we use passport use, and so on. We talk about how to do that. We db.get some kind of information here, and then we do and it talks about routes and all that stuff and how we can use our local strategy to sign in. It even gives us a sign-in form and even a post for everything else we want to do. So that's support for sessions. And says, ensure when you use a strategy, ensure that you have support for sessions. And if you look at this, it talks about how to do a session. Here's the we need to require session. It talks about the configuration, a serialized user with functions that we can use instead, and then a deserialized user down in here, okay, that we want to use, okay? So that's something that it talks about here when it comes to the user strategy that we want to use. So I'm just going to go back and And I want to talk about this because this is the configuration that it gives us online, right? Where we say passport.use and then some new local strategy that we want to initialize here with username and password, okay? Back to our code. So that's what we want here. This strategy, passport local strategy, is what we want to use, strategy, okay? Which is our local strategy. And I'm just going to check my notes right now just to make sure that I'm not completely insane before I talk to you guys, because I know this is, again, remember that I talked about this before? We always run into this problem with our stuff. And you know why we run into this? Because there's breaking changes, my friends. Constantly breaking change. The web is a, frenetic kind of thing that we can use sometimes. And so I'm just going to check my old repository here. That's what I'm doing. Just going to check this out. And just to make sure that, did I do it here or not? I did not. And just going to go back out one. I'm just doing this off screen for those people who are not here. And isn't that wonderful? I love when this kind of stuff happens. It's fantastic, right? Because, it's like, I feel like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he talks in his new Arnold thing. Just doing this off screen here, just to make sure I'm not completely crazy. Because, my friends, I just don't want that error. I'm trying to get rid of all my errors, right? Because if I have errors, bad things happen. And I don't want that. Let's do B. No. Yeah. So my user, nice, nice, nice. There's my user. It's a beautiful thing when you can check back at your old code, right? Which I do frequently. Because like I said, there's always something that causes us to have some kind of crazy issue, and I don't want that. So db, session. Okay, we did that part right. We did this part right. We don't care about that. Initialize the session. Okay, let's check this out. Maybe I missed something. Nope, we got that right. User create strategy, right? And serialize user to serialize user. And we don't need that part. That's why. We don't need that part right now. And do I even need that part right up there? Password local strategy, local strategy. Do I ever use it anywhere? I don't think so. No, I use it later. That's in the next part. See, I copied something in I didn't need. So I don't need this part. And I think we should still be able to authenticate. Okay, so that is what I have there. So now one thing that I have is I'm using my index router, and my index router right now is it's getting all my I'm using one router for my API because really there's nothing else. I'm not using like multiple things. You could have multiple routers, one route for your API, and if you had an index of logging in and logging out separately, you could have that as well. I'm not doing that here because I don't think I need it. Yeah. Okay. All right. So my configuration is done. Let's make sure we have no issues. So again, going back to here, it looks like we're still okay. I'm going to just ignore this. We don't need to care about that anymore. And I'm going to come back to, so this is the configuration. that I want to put together. So the configuration is for the most part done. One thing we need to do is in our movie controller, right? Now we got to think about in our movie controller, how do we add in, and I called this the index controller in here in the next thing. So I got the user model, and then the next part would be the index controller. I called it the index controller because this is where we put things in here. Okay, now again, you can use a separate controller for this, or you can use the same controller that you would use for your movies. It's up to you if you want to split that stuff up. But here what we need to do is an import passport from passport here. So going back to our controllers, we want to do that. So after we do this part, we want to say import passport from passport. Okay, we want to definitely do that because that gives us authentication. Okay, and then what we also want to do here is we want to import, before our movie model, we want to also import user from /models/user. Okay, that's our user model. Okay, so we're going to use that as well. And that is the configuration that we want to use for that part. This first part is how we process our register page, right? And actually, this is really should be called process registration, right? And I want to start with this because it's our first function, and I want to cut and paste here and talk about what we need and what we don't need, okay? Again, this is just to save time instead of me slogging this out. One thing that we can do is we know that registration and all that kind of stuff, we could have a different controller, like a user controller for any kind of thing, or an auth controller. So it's a totally separate controller for authentication. For us right now, we're just going to make it one. And you can see that I have an add movie and I have a display movie by ID and everything else. I really think authentication should come first and after any utility function. So this sanitize array is a utility function. That's what this thing is, right? And down in here, these are API functions. That's what those are, right? And then we might have in here our, kind of authentication functions or security functions, whatever you want to call it. Okay. We want to start off with register. So I'm going to kind of paste this in. Instead of it calling this register page, let's call this process registration, because that's what this thing is. Registration. Okay. That's what I'm going to call this thing. I want to copy the next part too. All right. So I'm going to go to the next page here and just copy all of this. This kind of gives us everything that we need, and we'll talk about it a little bit here. I know this is a little different than what we do normally. I slog it out with you and do this, but we'll talk about this in a second. Oh yeah, that's why it's having this problem here. Doesn't like my copy pasting, and that's okay. All right, let's talk about this a little bit. This is how you register. So going up to the top, from the top. So we have this function called process registration. We take a request, response, and next object, right? We create a new user object. The new user object has a username, an email address, and maybe some kind of display name. Okay, so what we do is we get from some kind of form field, take a look at the form field, request.body.username, request.body.email address, request.body.firstname plus request.body.lastname. And we're creating something called a display name. So when we use Postman, right, to do this kind of stuff, we need to know that we need a username, an email address, a first name, and a last name that we're going to get in our form. That's what this says, okay? This is our form data that we're getting in here. Next, we're going to user register a new user. So far, so good. We're going to use our request.body.password. That's another thing that you need to put in, a username and a password, right? Request.body.password. We're going to pass it in here. But however, the password is going to be hashed, right? Because we never want to see this password in clear text. And that's what our Passport Local Mongoose module is going to do for us. It's going to hash up our password, and so we're never going to have to see it in clear text. Then, if we have an error, we're going to return a success is false. So the JSON object, we can pass in whatever we want out to the JSON object this time. The JSON object isn't doing much except for communicating with us, telling us that a user was improperly registered or a user was properly registered. The return pushes us to leave and stops this from happening. Okay, that's what this thing does. Okay? If we had a front end, like Angular, React, or a mobile UI, we might want to do something that looks like this. We don't have a front end, so we're going to just comment this out. And we're going to do automatic authentication, where we're basically saying, hey, as soon as you register, we automatically authenticate you. However, we don't need to do that. Okay? And this is for the first time, a one-time only, where we authenticate the user. And their user is logged in. That's what we're doing here. Save. Okay? That's number one. The second thing is, that's our registration function, process registration, right? So we're going to save that, and we're going to put that up on GitHub. So we're going to say git add dot git commit -m, and we're going to say added registration, user registration. Git push. Lots of changes. Okay? Wonderful. So that's the first part. Next, once we've got our user we can register with the process registration function, we need another function for logging in and another one for logging out. We're not doing user management, okay? I'm not asking you in your app to be able to manage a user. That would require, what would it require if I wanted to manage a user? I needed some kind of role. There would have to be, adding a user. So not just registering, but adding a user, deleting a user, modifying a user, doing all those kind of things. We're not doing any of that. All right, that's not what we're doing. We're just registering, and that's all we're doing. Okay, so that's number one. One thing that the user checks for when we register is if the user's already been, if the user, based on their email and password, is the exact same. If the user is the exact same, email and username. If it's the user exact same, it'll give you an error saying, you've got a problem registering. And it's usually will spit out in the console. This is our developer console that the user already exists. So we can test that out. Next, let's kind of do the next part, which is the login function. So the login function seems quite long, but let's explain why this is so big. So I'm just going to grab this part, copy it, go back in here and paste it. And let's just put in the last part as well, just to make sure that there's no issues. I'm just going to go back into the last part, and this is the login function. All right. And we don't have a front end, so we're just going to do this for now. Just going to do some stuff like this, just to make sure that it's nice and balanced. We have some errors, and it says passport authenticate error user info doesn't compute, right? Passport authenticate. And it says that it takes in any, that's what it takes in, right? Any, followed by some passport authenticate options, followed by, right, some kind of callback. Look what it says here, right? So that's what it says now. So things have changed again, right? Passport local, followed by two any's, something, right? And followed by, like it says here, the way it is. Now, one thing that's great about some of these things is it gives you some examples about how this would look. So app.get protected, and it says here's an example. Passport authenticate local, right? And then it gives you a success redirect followed by a failure redirect, right? And then it does some of this. So this is one way of doing it, all right? So this is just an example of how the callback function would work. But what it's looking for, really, if you think about it, is it's looking for any and then any, which means I could put in something like a curly brace and a curly brace followed by that. That's what it might be looking for, you might think. And you can see that that's clearly not what the issue is. So that's not it. That's not what that is as well. It can also say that, if I go back to this might say something like, well, it says that error, the implicit type of any is what we're doing, and user is what type is it, right? Well, we want our user to be of type user. So we could sit there and say, well, user is of type user. We could say that, right? Here's our user model. But let's see what it does if we did that. If we did that and we said user is of type user, it says user refers to a value, but it's being used as a type here. Did you mean type of user? Let me explain that. So although we have user here, which is of mongoose iUser type, right? Here, user is not what we're referring to. It says if not user, right? Then if the user doesn't exist, kind of thing, then res JSON failure, user not logged in successfully, right? If the user doesn't exist. But that would mean that it's my request.user. That's where this comes from, the user itself, the user object, right? And error, again, we don't know what type this is. This is all new. And so is info, which is we don't know what type it is. So because we're not allowing any type, for now to silence the errors, what type of errors could there be? Could be HTTP errors. But for now, we're just going to put any, just to silence these errors. We're going to come back to this and fix it. Any. And that's the first part. The first part is, do we have an issue? The next part, do we have any other errors anywhere? So if I go up here, are there any errors that I can see? Because, we want to have no errors in our document, right? So one thing is that, we want to find any errors in our code, and it's still showing us an error. Okay, so this could be a copy-paste error. This could be a lot of things. Okay, so one thing to note is, we want to be able to isolate what the problem is. Whenever I have an error, I always think to myself, did I have enough curly braces? So I always go through and here's my login. So first thing is, here's this curly brace. What curly brace does this refer to? This one. Okay, what curly brace does this refer to? This one, right? So these ones can be on top of each other, right? These ones are on top of each other. This is good. And there's my issue, right? It says res JSON, and I want to have a user which is a new user. Well, there is no new user, right? User is this user right here. So that is the user that I want to put out, and that's the problem. It's just a typo. So if the user exists, right, then we don't need this clearly, right, because the user doesn't exist. This says if the user does not exist, then just put in we're not authenticated. Here's something that's going to happen. Will we ever see a positive authentication here with a session? Think about it. Will I ever see some kind of positive message, right? Well, there isn't anything, right? Because it says, hey, if there was a negative message, it'll come up here. If we can do this, if we get to this point right here, then we can do this part, which is basically saying, hey, let's authenticate the user based on the user data that's going to come inbound. Okay, here's my user data, which is of type any right now. Okay, so this is kind of what we want, right? If the user's logged in. But most likely we're never going to see the user logged in because it's checking here. It's saying, take a look here. It's saying, okay, so password authenticate, my user's any, here's where the user's coming from, right? And I'm getting my request, my response, and next object. And what's happening is down in here, I'm passing in my request, my response, and my next object. Here they are, right? So this up here is kind of like my request user. That's kind of what it is. My user here is my request user, right? The user that I'm getting from my request. All right, that's what's happening. Okay. That's the login function that we have so far. We're going to troubleshoot that one. And the last one is the log out function. Okay, the log out function. I'm going to take a short break after this. And let me explain how this works. So here's our log out function. Okay. And it says, right, we have our process logout, and it says request.logout, and it says an argument for, it says expected 1 or 2 arguments but got 0, right? And express request logout. Take a look here. It says, so options, and then done. That's what it says. So it's expected 1 to 2 arguments but got 0, right? And what we did with arguments is we got nothing. Here's some options, and here's our done. If we get done, we do something afterwards. So when we log out, we can do something when we're done. This is new, again. This is something that has changed since the last time, okay? So what it's looking at is at least 1 argument. So if I put this in, yes, it can silence everything, but that's not really what it wants. It wants a callback function. That's what it wants, at minimum, to do something that looks like this. And what we'll do is we'll put in this console log out here, okay? What it also does is when it's done, it's going to do a response.json, right? That's what this thing is going to do. Notice that this function does not have a return type, but these ones do. Why? Because typically what we do is when we do a process login or process registration, we're going to do a post request. Okay, that's what those type of requests are going to be, right? But when we process a logout, we usually do a get request because there's nothing to send. Log in and register, we need to send sensitive information. So we would do it in a post request. But for logging out, we don't need it. And so that way, we don't need to do a return. That's how it works, okay? Once we call logout, it's going to log you out. If there's any user that was logged in there, it's just going to log them out. So that's why it always kind of works if you call it. Okay, and we'll see if we get any of this stuff at all. Save. Let's put this up on GitHub. Git add dot, git commit -m, we'll say added login and logout functions. And now we're sitting at 9:42. We've gone for a long time. Let's take a short break, get some water, maybe do a washroom break, make some calls, whatever we have to do. And then we'll come back in 10 minutes around 9:50.